Hello, everybody, and thanks for coming along to this English Australia webinar presented by Aggie Bodis. Aggie is an associate lecturer at the Department of Linguistics at Macquarie University in New South Wales, and she won the 2019 English Australia Award for Contribution to Professional Practice for her essay on integrating intercultural competence into ESL curriculum. She's also written a peer-reviewed article for the English Australia Journal on this same topic. So thanks so much for coming along and presenting this webinar this afternoon, Aggie.
Hi, Sophie. Hi, everyone. I would like to start by acknowledging the Bedegal people that are the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here today. So I'll start with a quote and I'll let you know what the significance of this to today's topic. Language is very powerful. Language does not describe reality. Language creates the reality it describes. I came across this quote in a short video on BBC News. This video was about a mother of a child who lives with Down syndrome, who describes the way she has found certain comments quite hurtful. Little things like language use when people want to compliment her, but they do it in a way that ends up hurting her. As an example, she mentions the use of but or though in a statement that's meant to be a compliment, like he's got nice hair though, or the word risk in the phrase risk of Down syndrome rather than chance of Down syndrome. So she developed a set of flashcards to raise awareness that communication about Down syndrome is essential for inclusion. And these cards are used in various by various advocacy groups, and as they're simple and clear. Now, the way, and these are the cards here, and you can find them on through this link. Now, the way I see language and this concept that language creates reality is that it's quite abstract, something that happens as a phenomenon. It looks like it's happening on its own, but language does not just create reality on its own, of course. It is us who, through the language, create reality. And this responsibility is something I would like to stress here. Inclusion is our responsibility. So the example of these flashcards shows how reaching out to people, reaching people with a message can change behavior and change perceptions as well. These cards have been picked up by hospitals and displayed as posters, and you can see the parallel through these powerful institutions like hospitals can, language use can change reality. Educational institutions, in our case, can create inclusion as well. And as our focus today is on curriculum planning, I'd like to make the point that we can create reality through language use in our approach to teaching and in our approach to curriculum design and materials design. And inclusion is our responsibility. So the main sections of my talk are the following. I have perfected the minimalism of headings here. Why intercultural competence? What is intercultural competence? Where would you put it? How would you include it into your curriculum? And what else is important? So let's start with why. Let me contextualize it through higher education in Australia, because this is the context I work in. And also because a lot of ESL teaching in Australia as well, in the ELICOS context as well, leads to higher education too. So higher education has shifted from a focus on building capacity in the Australian population and providing aid to countries in the Asia Pacific. So these were the first international students, right? To education as an enterprise. And internationalization itself came with this process and the increase of international students in Australia. Now, research has shown that international students have been found to be to experience segregation and exclusion in their educational context and in the broader societal discourses as well. This is one of the findings of my PhD research. So in an aim to attract more students, and I also assume also because they are generally concerned for students' well-being, the whole concept of student experience has become really emphasized in higher education in Australia. And I would also say that COVID-19 has increased this concern even more. So the aim of integrating intercultural competence in course curricula is to improve the student experience through an inclusive curriculum and through this empower international students as well. Now, I haven't talked about ESL or ELICOS sector yet, but whereas while you can actually apply this kind of approach to any kind of teaching curriculum, I'm going to show it to you through examples through ESL. Okay, so let's start with a question here. So we all work with courses that have learning outcomes, competencies, and here's one for you. Imagine that you need to start addressing this competence in your course. How would you start that? How would you approach this? Now I'll need to find the chat. If you could just put it in the chat. So you can start with looking at your tasks. I'm trying to give you some time to put it in your chat. So deciding what the outcomes were for the course and considering methodologies. Thank you. Conducting a needs analysis. Great. And narrowing down what that culturally diverse environment means and what communication means as well, right? Yeah. Okay. So this is what I had at the outset of a curriculum project I took part in before the pandemic changed the world, of course. Got some more through activities that involve students mixing students from different language groups across classes. Yeah, interaction, right? Likely environments, thank you for that. So these are all really great starting points. So I'm going to tell you, oh, you can't see anything in the chat. Well, that's why I'm reading them around. Yeah, okay. I'll try to read everything that I get here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through that journey that I took in looking at how to narrow it down, how to make it reality, really. But what I'd also like to address early on is that I don't use the term culture to refer to people from different countries or language backgrounds only, as we are all different and we are all from this, even if we're from the same country or language background or generation, gender, we are all different. So this is what I mean by cultural diversity here, not just people from the same country, but also inside that entity as well. So, and this is why I also argue in my research in general and elsewhere that enhancing intercultural competence should not be just confined to second language users of English or international students only, but everyone really. So try to keep an eye on the chat, but it's just disappeared. Let's move on to the what part. I was involved in a curriculum project at UNSW Global in 2019. And just as you saw in the previous slide, one of the course learning outcomes was about developing intercultural competence. I was also in the middle of data analysis for my research, so I kind of applied my research methods, was in the mindset to analyze things. So what I did is I had a look at learning outcomes, and I tried to narrow it down what is needed for these students. And I looked at them as they are embedded into various levels of programs. And let me show you what I had. I actually collected all the learning outcomes that are related to intercultural competence. Now, this was the course that I was working on, the direct entry course. And I identified the learning outcomes, so interact and contribute as an active participant in the university discourse community, demonstrating awareness of appropriacy and intercultural competence. And this course sat in an academic division, which also had program learning outcomes. So I identified the one that was related to intercultural competence, and I did the same with the institutional graduate capability as well. And this institution was sitting in a wider university context. So I identified the graduate capability there too. So what I did is I used thematic analysis and identified some main building blocks here. And what I found was some kind of awareness, some kind of attitude, and some kind of behavior. So the building blocks for intercultural competence for these students were these three concepts. Now, this was not the only source that I used. I drew on because from research, I was aware that international students value social interaction as part of their student experience, not necessarily in the curriculum itself, or not just academically or in their courses, but outside as well. And also from my own research, I knew that academic staff and other students and the broader public judge international students' capability through oral interactions with them. So what this means that speaking skills, especially speaking skills and pronunciation, feature really highly in making judgments about the capabilities of international students in terms of language proficiency and disciplinary ones as well. So I was aware that social interaction and communication are really important for these students. Now, what is intercultural competence? There are many various models. So I thought, let's just find a model. And then I found that there's so many of them that they're actually categorized into model types. So what you need when you want to choose a model, of course, you need to know why you need that model and what you want to achieve with it. And for me, that was looking at the curriculum. So there are, and I just put a few examples here. There are compositional models that look at the various components of intercultural competence, but not necessarily the relationships between these components. Co-orientational models look at how not just the individual, but how a person acts in an environment, and how people achieve common understanding, for example. Now, what you can see that I highlighted here was developmental models, and that's the one that I found useful because developmental models can account for time, the time needed to achieve a change in behavior, and sustained relationship, or being exposed to things can change things. So this is where I found developmental models useful. And I've got some examples here for adaptational models, this one here, and causal process models. Now, the model that I found useful, and you can find many more if you're interested in this chapter, Spitzberg and Chagnon. You can find the reference in the reference list. Now, I found Deerdorf's model developmental model really useful, as it showed the sequence and also reflected the components that I've identified in the learning outcomes. So this model identifies attitudes that facilitate intercultural competence, like respect and openness. And as the individual develops this kind of knowledge and skills, it will trickle down to some kind of internal outcome, a changed frame of reference, a changed way of thinking that will be cause some kind of behavioral changes as well. So external outcomes. The good thing about this model is that it feeds back into itself, so it causes even more changes. Now, how to use this to make sure the curriculum facilitates this. And I also like to mention assessment here, because if you think about curriculum, because of constructive alignment, you need to think about assessment too. So you need to align the course outcomes, the assessment, and the teaching content, or whatever you teach. So whatever the course outcomes puts emphasis on, you need to make sure that it's assessed and you teach to it as well. And in our case, given that we talk about language courses, the communication aspect could be emphasized here. So to be able to sequence these components in teaching materials, I found that I had to modify it a bit. So I put awareness first. I found that this works best because it creates some kind of input for the students, so building the knowledge and awareness of diversity and practices. And so this is followed by attitude, which you can facilitate by tasks, statement analysis and evaluation, and then behavior. So that's the kind of productive task, communication aimed tasks. As I mentioned, that ESL courses would probably put more emphasis on communication, but if you would have more tasks in this area. But I also thought that if you teach in a context where there's a lot of, say, linguistic or cultural homogeneity, if such thing exists, then you would probably put a bit of awareness, put a bit of more emphasis on awareness in terms of internal diversity, to make sure that we're not all the same just because we speak the same first language. So how can you make sure that your materials and your teaching covers the three components I outlined in this slide? And where in the curriculum do we address intercultural competence? So the first step is to look at what you already have, or in other words, audit your curriculum. I worked out some guiding questions and I've copied a few here. Now, these questions are generic, so they could be used in different ESL courses, but they could be modified and narrowed down to more specialized ones as well. And of course, you can add more. So in terms of awareness, how much is diversity reflected in the course materials? Do the input text have an element of cultural diversity? Facilitate talking about various points of view. Think about, the reading text that you use or the pictures that you have as well. So visual representation is important here too. Do the text in the language focused tasks reflect social and cultural diversity? What kind of names do you use if you, ethnic names, for example, in your sample sentences? Attitude, do reflection-focused tasks facilitate accepting cultural, linguistic, social diversity through analysis and evaluation? Do reflection and discussion questions homogenize groups rather than acknowledge intercultural diversity? This is where phrasing the questions, your discussion questions would be important. So instead of in your country, you could say where you live or the people that you know, etc. Do the tasks facilitate the development of tolerating ambiguity? Now, in the last part, I put behavior in the heading, but it's really, if you can see the questions, they're all communication focused. So is language for cross-cultural communication addressed? Through pragmatics, I would say, you would just focus on things that are meant in a way in one language or are used differently in others. I've got some examples in the next slide. Is it non-culture specific? So by this, I meant, is it valuing the student's input as well? So let's say you've got the example of functions of indirectness in a language. Can you actually facilitate a discussion or something about what it is in other languages that the students speak, or is it just one-sided and say, this is how we do it in Australia and learn it? Are there practice activities? Are there tasks and require students to demonstrate intercultural competence? And I highlighted it in red. Is any of the above part of any assessment task? And you can think about just being aware and assessing it formatively as well, somewhat as a summative or formal assessment task. I just like to open the chat because I can see that there are some in there. Just can't see it right away. Okay. So as the next step, we are up to how now. As the next step, tasks can be developed to address various aspects of intercultural competence and various stages of it to scaffold intercultural competence through the curriculum. Now, tasks can build on each other to start from awareness and go down, attitude and communication. Once you sequenced it, the sequence don't necessarily happen in one lesson, so you don't necessarily address all of it in one lesson, but it can go through the whole course. Or you can put more, as I mentioned, you can put more emphasis on one aspect of it, depending on the student's needs, the needs of the curriculum, on the target language use. So I have two examples here. The first one is a classic. So you just imagine that you have to do a listening task, which involves a video of an interview. So you could set up a pre-task for your students that includes them researching body language and how body language is used in different parts of the world. And I put cultures there, there you go. Different subcultures as well, generations, etc. And students fill in a table or just present their findings in some way. And once you have focused on, you've done your listening and you've focused on comprehension tasks, language focus tasks, whatnot, you can have a post task on body language. So the students go back to that video and have a look at it, analyze it in terms of the body language they've learned. And then you can have some kind of communication tasks that have to do with role playing, different challenging situations where body language can be misinterpreted, for example. And then this could be somehow assessed formatively, or it could be part of your summative assessment as well. So if you've got presentations, although I'm aware that you might need to narrow down what kind of body language you're focusing on there. So the second example I've got here doesn't really have anything in the awareness box. It focuses on politeness, but you can easily think about, some kind of input text. Let students read a text about politeness, something to do, a story or some kind of information text. And then they would do a discussion task related to something, maybe that text, and then students also could reflect on how they express politeness in their discussions. Or if it's just too complicated to connect it to text, I would just go with discuss something, and then they reflect on what they discussed, or how they use politeness there. And then again, they could actually compare practices, and that would be a really useful learning. I find that as a teacher, I learn a lot from these discussions as well. So the practice task could be addressing cross-cultural pragmatics, like how you express requests, how you agree, disagree, and other aspects of politeness as well. And it could be part of your assessment task if you assess discussion skills, for example. Now, I have something specific here. So let's look at what we can do with existing materials. So not creating something from scratch. We had in the English Australia online article discussion event that happens after each volume comes out, issue comes out. We had an online discussion where this page from a course book provoked some discussion, and I've ended up putting it in my teaching materials in the planning unit I teach at Macquarie University. So I'm going to show you a page from a textbook which is a B1 level, Navigate B1. The topic is pavement rage, and it's about, well, there's a title of the reading, it's about how a busy street can be made pedestrian friendly by adding a fast lane to the footpath. So the tasks, I'm not going to show you yet because I just want to tell you what you need to do. The tasks cover various forms of reading comprehension of a text, and also some discussion tasks. There's some language work too. And the text looks like it's one-sided. So it focuses on Oxford Street in London, and it assumes that we all find crowds annoying and problematic. Now, what I'd like you to do in the chat is just tell me, how do you think you could change some of the tasks to cater to wider attitudes? Because you might not find that kind of crowd on the footpath really problematic in some parts of the world, right? And how could you integrate communication into the communication aspect of intercultural competence in here? So I hope you can see these, but let me just go through quickly. So you have a task here. Have you heard of pavement rage? What do you think it is? So engaging with the topic, and then students will need to read this short text and check whether they were right. Then there's some language work here. Then some reflection. How do you feel when people walk slowly in front of you? Can you think of a good solution? 8 is about reading comprehension. And 9 is a discussion. Work with a partner. Would you like a fast lane where you live? Think of 2 good and 2 bad points about having a fast lane in your town or city. So I'm going to open up the chat. I'm going to find it first. So attitude and communication. Yes. So someone mentioned that 7B, the second line, assumes that walking slow is bad. Can you think of a good solution, right? Yeah. Yeah, so Julia mentions, I would start with a discussion on students' attitudes to crowded places. Yeah, some people just love them, right? Experiences in busy places, how they feel about people walking slow, fast, in crowded spaces. So some of this can be done on a lesson planning level, right? How would you just modify the task? But also you need to supplement it as well. And you could really easily add some aspects of intercultural competence here. So Paul says, in some countries, for example, Vietnam, it can be almost impossible to walk on the pavement in some areas. That's right. So adapting, maybe start with what number of people makes them feel uncomfortable. Oh, I see. Too many, too few? Too few, that's an interesting point, Claire. And how would you address communication? Oh, here, this is really interesting. In some countries, if you don't ask politely, you will never get anywhere. You use elbows. I'm not going to read the end of it. Exactly. And I think this is where pragmatics comes in as well. how do you ask people politely, or how do you ask people to move? Yeah, perceptions of personal space. We talk about that. My students have come up with polite requests, thinking of teaching students how to do that, maybe through a matching task in different situations, non-verbal communication, something about annoyance. And also, as you mentioned here in the chat, do you say anything, or what do you say? And how directly do you say that? It doesn't necessarily mean that you're impolite if you, yeah, and I think that that helps with tolerance as well. You would role play it. Well, mind you, I guess with COVID-19, you would probably need to be careful in some places of the world to keep the 1.5 meters, right? Yeah. Issues about time, it's a good point. Time to get to places, time at work, online. I'm not really sure how that, oh yeah, you would role play it online. I see, okay. Okay. All right. So you would do some kind of discussion task here, but here's a chance of actually teaching language, functional language as well, right? Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your input. So this was an example of how you can just have a look at what you have and see whether you address these components of intercultural competence. Okay. So we're up to what else now? So I have mentioned assessment. Intercultural competence as such is not something that has an end result, just like language. Now you're ready, you are interculturally competent. It's part of a lifelong process, so this makes it difficult to assess, really. Deerdorf has written about assessment, but not specifically about ESL. She mentions students' interviews and narrative diaries in the higher education context. But for our purposes, I think that once you have identified the main components of intercultural competence that are relevant for your course, it becomes easier to know what you want to assess and how you can assess these, and whether you want to assess them summatively or formatively. Formatively, if it happens during the delivery of your tasks, it's really easy. Summatively, it will most probably happen as part of your existing assessment if you have this kind of interactional assessments or something to do with, with oral communication. Although you can, of course, assess it in writing as well. You see essay writing, for example. You can see that these are both based on direct and indirect evidence. So, for example, the teacher can observe, in the follow-up or intro tasks to skills lessons, and that would be direct evidence. You can see how students perform, but unless it's some kind of reflection. But the reflective tasks would be indirect evidence, so an account of the students. But I'd be interested to see what you think about assessment. What else is needed? So in Lisk and Carol's words, we need to move beyond wishing and hoping, that just because we have different cultures represented in our institutions, we are by default truly intercultural. And these authors highlight the need to take, and I quote, deliberate and strategic actions to assist all students to move outside of their cultural comfort zone. The authors mentioned the alignment of formal and informal curricula. So what I've talked about here was formal curriculum, but we can talk about, reflection, mentoring programs, group work outside, your curriculum or your assessment task, for example. So it is important to note that intercultural competence is important for all students, all cohorts, whether ESL or first language users of English. However, what aspect of intercultural competence the curriculum and task design focus on depends on the learning outcomes of the course and the students' needs, as you've mentioned as well. And I hope that through this presentation, I've helped translate intercultural competence into more concrete and practical concepts. Thank you. Now, I'm happy to answer any questions. I've got the references here. I'm just wondering if your questions would be in the chat or the Q&A. No, nothing in the Q&A. Oh, that's really interesting, Paul. I'll just read your comment here. It's about assessment. Time and communication are a common issue for seminar discussions. Some students perceive dominance in a conversation as a sign of strength and silence as weakness, while other cultures respect silence. This occurs at an individual personality trait level as well within cultures. Our assessment criteria has attempted to take this into account. Oh, I would be really interested to know how you did that, Paul. If you can, I don't have my email on this, but if you could just let me know, I'd be happy to talk to you about this. And I think it's a part of, we actually have to be aware that what our criteria are prioritizing as well. So are we actually rewarding dominance in a discussion rather than content or other parts of like politeness or expressing all these aspects of intercultural competence? I'm not sure if I'm looking at the right thing. Does anyone have any questions? Or maybe you could share how your thoughts about assessment. How can teachers develop their intercultural communication? That's really interesting. That's an interesting question for teachers. Well, I have a feeling it has to do with professional development and attending as many of these kind of webinars as you can. There are many resources for that. I've got a few books, but I won't be able to show you these, but there are books about intercultural classrooms. They're not necessarily ESL focused though, so they're more general education focused, but they're excellent resources. The other concept that you will find interesting is global competence. And that would be interesting to see. Well, probably not, they're not one-on-one equality there. You can't really say that that's the same concept, but you will find resources in that area as well. Okay, so we've got a few questions here. Okay. Okay, so it seems hard to measure. Yeah, that was my point too. So assessed more formatively or by can-do criteria. Self-assessment, reflection, I would say. Yeah, observation. Making an effort to learn students' birth names has been an important process in my classroom. I have a number of older Chinese students who really appreciate it, and I have learned their full name themselves. I actually have written about this, how interesting this whole English name concept is. And we've had a really interesting conversation in one of the master's units that I convened about that. I also found that it becomes names are an interesting point, especially when it comes to I don't know, imposing that expectation on students that they need to change their names because you can't really pronounce them, right? Okay, got a question here. Oh, that's particularly related to the course that I looked at, the learning outcomes for. How these courses have been successful in this regard? How successful have they been in the assessment part? I think if it's not really, it hasn't really been incorporated there. I mean, I really don't know because I haven't been working there for a while, but I think what has been mentioned in the chat as well, I think it's important to make sure that if it's formatively assessed, if it's summatively assessed, then you make sure that it's in your criteria and you make sure what you want your students to produce. Okay, I'm just trying to find questions here. Okay. Task descriptors as well, the rubric are a good place to start. Oh yeah, when it comes to discussions, right? I feel that understanding the cultural diversity is fluid is a good start. The quality of teacher questions as curious, non-biased educators is a vital function. Yeah, I agree with that. And then we've got a lot of resources on names in Aussie LT. That's true. Yeah, we've got a few questions about comments about using student first names. Oh yeah, I can see the question here. How do the teachers develop a rubric for intercultural competence assessment? I wouldn't really just have a rubric for that on its own. It's not something that stands on its own. It's part of. It really depends what kind of courses you're in, you're teaching in, really. But I would say, in the context at least that I've been looking at, assessment has to be related to something as part of something like a writing or some kind of presentation or a discussion task. Yeah. I can't see any more questions here. If you would like to contact me about anything, I'd be happy to work with you or have a look at assessment tasks and consult you. I would be interested to look at how it's done elsewhere.
I think there are a couple of other questions that have just come through, Aggie, if you have time to answer them.
Mm-hmm. Online summative assessment can be tricky as students are chasing grades, which makes cheating more likely. Oh, that's a good point. Any advice? Well, I don't know if it's really important to summatively assess it in that case. Do you think it is? It really depends. Online assessment has turned the world upside down, hasn't it? But I think you can still assess it formatively. Sorry, I'm starting to mix up these things. In online communication, right? All these functions like, can you see my slide? And all the things that people say and how you express, how you communicate online also, it's a different kind of, different genre as well. You could assess it in writing. You could assess it in through forums, maybe online discussion forums.
I've just been back through the chat and there was another question. Do you have any ideas for demonstrating what productive intercultural competence or communication, I guess, looks like?
Demonstrating. Yeah, I would say that's what you can assess, and that's the thing. That's another weakness of assessing intercultural competence. How do you assess awareness, really? How do you assess the other aspects of it? You assess the behavior, really, right? So that makes it hard. Yes, you can assess communication. Yeah, so oral tasks, written tasks. I'm trying to find questions here. Okay, so the language of online meetings. Yes, this is what I talked about as well. I guess that kind of also the way you don't get direct response from someone. How do you communicate like this? I can't see anyone, for example, except for Sophie. Okay. Oh, that's a good question. How does my student support area promote intercultural competence at my uni? I don't know, actually. I think it must be done through the pathway programs, but I'm not really sure how it happens once you're at university. I'm convinced that you have to actually make sure that you integrate this into your curriculum yourself. So it should be done by lecturers themselves. But I hope I can raise awareness a bit more. Yeah, I don't know any formal ways of doing this. There have been projects of language support, like integrated into the disciplinary areas at Macquarie Uni, like at the business school. But I'm not really sure that maybe communication, intercultural communication, was part of it. But I can't really comment on it. I can't say for sure. Okay, you're saying that international support teams. Well, I guess they address those kind of how was that again? Informal curriculum, right? And that complements the formal curriculum. Okay. Some post-entry English language support programs incorporate intercultural competence. Yes, I'm pretty sure they do. I just can't really give you an example from Macquarie University. What do you think about combining and developing both social intelligence and intercultural competence skills together? So, what do we mean by social intelligence, David? It's more like the awareness, right, that I was referring to. If it is, then of course I think it's part of it. Self-awareness, self-regulation, empathy. That's an interesting question. I had the same feeling about critical thinking. Like, there's such an overlap between these concepts, right? There is an overlap, but they're different in a way, right? I would be interested to know more about these. I can't really. All I can say is that I've thought of finding it difficult to somehow separate them. Yeah. Intersectionality has overlap too. In what sense? Like if you're a woman, is that what you mean? All parts of your personality, I guess, right? So your socioeconomic background, all your experience, different parts of your identity. Yeah, exactly. Including your culture, whatever you mean by culture. Yeah, yeah. It all makes, and that's why I think it's a good point not to just generalize culture to country and language background. Mm. Okay, we've got a question in Q&A too. Is there an overlap with ethics, intercultural perceptions of what is ethical or unethical? That's a really interesting question, Paul. Yeah, so people are used to not paying the public transport fare, for example, right? Yeah, or what is something that's considered to be ethical in a well, I guess it's also has to do with education, right? When it comes to academic integrity, right? What your expectations and experiences are regarding learning as well. Like, do you just reproduce what the teacher has told you, or yeah? I guess it does, and it's another aspect that you can discuss. And I do feel that you need to keep in mind that you're part of an institution that has ethical rules, and you need to just make sure that whatever you discuss, you kind of make students aware that it's fine, but they need to keep within those rules. And also academic integrity. It's important that students know, and also teachers know, that just because students plagiarize, it doesn't necessarily mean that they do it on purpose. They might be doing it because they don't know how to avoid it, or they have many other underlying reasons for that. Yeah.
Okay, Aggie, well, thank you so much for taking the time to go through all those questions and comments, because I think it got to a really interesting moment in the conversation. So it was good to let it go then. Thanks also to everyone who was contributing to those chat discussions as well. So yeah,
Thank you.
Aggie, happy birthday. So when we scheduled this webinar, Aggie somehow forgot that it was her birthday on this date, or didn't compute it. It's the kind of thing I do, you know, like schedule something really important on my birthday. But so thank you for going ahead with it and presenting for us today. It was a really informative presentation. It was also great to workshop some practical curriculum examples together, and also to talk about examples in assessment and think about that constructive alignment. So thank you very much, Aggie, and thanks everyone for coming. We will email people tomorrow with the recording and the slides, and also information about how you can download your statement of attendance for today's session. Thank you.
Thank you.